will be recording this session. If anyone does not feel comfortable with that, now is your chance to leave and you can watch the recording later. And excited to have you all here. It looks like we have a pretty good crowd. So for those who do not know me, my name is Jen Kleindienst. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Sustainability Director here at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, for those who may be joining us from afar. My office has been around since 2012. We do a variety of different programming, work with strategic planning, thinking about what's in the curriculum. And more recently, we've been trying to increase our focus on civic engagement and environmental justice. And our guest tonight, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, is going to teach us a little bit about both of those things. So just a few housekeeping things while we get started. As you might have already noticed at the bottom of your screen, there is live captioning turned on. Just so you all know, it is not perfectly accurate, as you may have already noticed. I'm not looking at it as I'm talking, but it's the best Zoom can do with live captioning. If you have an older version of Zoom, you may or may not be able to see the captions. I'm not sure. If there's something that you don't want to look at the bottom of your screen, if you're using a computer and you click on the little arrow next to the CC icon, you have the opportunity to hide the subtitles or to open the transcript, which then in your right sidebar will bring up information on how to, so that way you can see who's talking. Otherwise, everyone's voices just go all together in one. Please feel free to have your video off during the session, but if you're willing and able, when we get to question and answers at the end, if you're willing, we ask that you turn your video on just so that we can see who you are. Everyone will be muted during the meeting, but you are free to unmute yourself during the Q&A. Note that the chat will be enabled throughout the session, so we're only going to take questions at the very end, but if there's a burning question you think of, feel free to type it in the chat. And then Simi, who I will spotlight right now, who's one of the sustainability coordinators in the office, will be keeping an eye on the chat and keeping an eye on questions for the end. Also, if you have some technical issue or anything like that, please let her know through the chat, and then we can try to help you out. All right, and so now I'm going to turn this over to Annika. Annika is a Wesleyan student who had a role and has met Rhiana Gunn-Wright before. So Annika is going to do our introduction.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, Jen. My name is Annika Legrand-Wittisch, and I'm a sophomore at Wesleyan. I previously served as communications director for Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and during that time, I had the distinct privilege of working alongside our guest speaker, Rhiana Gunn-Wright. Rhiana is the director of climate policy at the Roosevelt Institute. Before joining Roosevelt, she was the policy director for the think tank New Consensus, charged with developing and promoting the Green New Deal, among other projects. She has also served as policy director for Abdul Assaid's 2018 Michigan gubernatorial campaign and as policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department and a member of former First Lady Michelle Obama's policy team. A 2013 Rhodes Scholar, she graduated magna cum laude from Yale in 2011 with majors in African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Thank you for joining us, Rhiana.
Hi, it's a pleasure. Can you hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thanks for spending some of your 3-day weekend here listening to us talk about climate policy. And so tonight we're going to, it's going to be a bit interactive. So I'm going to be asking some questions. There's going to be a whiteboard at some point where I'm going to ask a question and you can throw up responses. So just so you're ready, it's not going to be me talking the entire 90 minutes. And this talk is also going to be a bit different than talks that that I usually give about the Green New Deal, because Jen let me know that you all really wanted to talk about civic engagement. So one of the things that I'm going to actually talk a lot about is how the Green New Deal came about. So in terms of the organizing, in part, but really just how did we get this from an idea that we had that we were working on to something that was on the national stage, and now something that is influencing climate policy at the White House. So, and then I'm going to talk a little bit, sort of like in the second part of the talk, about what are some of the things that allowed us to do that, what skills did we have, and talk a little bit about how that's different than the ways that often we think about these things happening. Just because I think a big part of civic engagement, at least when it comes, when I think about when I'm motivated to do it, it's feeling that like I can actually do something, that there's actually space for me, and whatever community that I'm working in at the time, to make change. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. And then the third part of the talk is just, we're going to talk a little bit about ways that you all can get more involved in climate policy and climate organizing, if that's something that you're interested in. So before I jump in to any of that, though, I think it's important to talk first about what the Green New Deal is, because it's something that we say a lot, but even now, the resolution came out uh, a little over a year ago in February 2019. And people still often, for very good reasons, are not sure quite what it is. So the Green New Deal, at its core, the Green New Deal at its core is a proposal for a 10-year economic mobilization with 5 goals: eliminating greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers, creating millions of good high-wage jobs that ensure prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States, invest in the infrastructure and industry of the US to sustainably meet the challenges of the 21st century, secure clean air and water, climate and community resilience, healthy food, access to nature, and sustainable environment for all, and promoting justice and equity. So I'll dive into those 5 goals in just a second, but I think it's important to just note what an economic mobilization is. So economic mobilization is pretty much what it sounds like, but essentially all that it means is that government, through a mixture of policy, incentives, sometimes propaganda campaigns, pushes the entire economy towards a shared set of goals. So a lot of times people think about like the New Deal or World War II mobilization as the main examples of mobilization. So for instance, in World War II, the federal government bought factories to produce artillery machinery, things that were needed that private companies couldn't afford to build or weren't willing to build. And then they let those companies come in and run that thing. They pushed a lot of private companies to switch what they usually make. So like, for instance, Ford started making tanks instead of cars, right? But all of that was because the federal government essentially said, we have to create this much artillery, this much machinery, far outside of what we are capable of making now. And then they essentially got the entire government, along with the private sector, to do these sets of things. And that's what we're calling for again, but this time with what we sometimes refer to as like a climate, jobs, and justice nexus. All of that means is that it's a mobilization that is about decarbonizing, creating millions of jobs, and in that process, redistributing power so that we have a more just economy, and that we honestly undo some of the harms that we have done, not just sort of in history in general, but including in past economic mobilizations. So the New Deal, for instance, didn't include agricultural and domestic workers in Social Security. Why was that? That was because the vast majority of agricultural and domestic workers were Black, and Southern senators didn't want them to have access. Southern senators and representatives didn't want them to have access to money that might make it so that they weren't as easy to exploit, so that they might not accept such low wages. And so the Green New Deal is designed to undo some of that to whatever extent is possible. And so that means that on the one hand, the Green New Deal is this plan for an economic mobilization. But because economic mobilization requires all of government, part of what that means is that the Green New Deal is also a governing agenda. It's saying that all of the parts of government need to be focused on these things. This is what should organize a lot of government activity for the next 10 years. This is what you should be essentially building presidential administrations around. And we'll talk a little bit later, but that is actually starting to happen with the Biden-Harris administration. So that's one thing. So it's a governing agenda. It's also a resolution. You might have heard of the Green New Deal resolution, HR 109. That's what was introduced by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey when, I don't know if you might have seen, basically last February it came out, and that's when people were talking about AOC and Markey introduced a Green New Deal. What's this Green New Deal? That's when people say like the Green New Deal resolution, that's what they're talking about. And the resolution is essentially just a statement outlining what a Green New Deal is, what the proposal is, and in particular, what are the goals? So those 5 goals that I mentioned, those are in the resolution. What are the goals? What are the projects? So the interesting thing about economic mobilization is that because it's about essentially pushing an economy to do a certain thing, in this case, to transition off of fossil fuels and towards clean and renewable energy, and also all that requires, right? Because we say that, but that doesn't just mean, oh, tomorrow we'll just put solar panels everywhere and we're done, right? Transitioning off of fossil fuels is basically like not eating food anymore as a human. If you think about fossil fuels, it provides energy for our society. It's what we use to run. Same way as humans eat food to get our bodies to run. So if tomorrow someone said, oh, you can't eat food anymore, it's going to get really, really bad in 30 years. You all need to, I don't know, eat red algae. How much would change, right? It's not just all of a sudden the grocery store would just be full of red algae. You have all these problems. Where do you get it from? How do you grow enough? Who owns it, right? All of a sudden, whoever sat near red algae, are they millionaires now? Are they billionaires? Is it the new oil trade? We don't know. And it's very similar when you think about trying to move an economy off of fossil fuels. That means that you're going to have to plan your cities differently, right? So people have to drive less so that they're more walkable. It means that some of the most powerful industries in the history of the world will have to wind down, that they won't exist in the ways that they exist right now. Those are big changes. And the resolution sort of lays out principles for how to do that and how to root that transition in justice and equity. And also gives a list of the projects, because there is so much work to do in order to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, a list of the projects that would entail. And to also reduce emissions. So that includes things like changing the agricultural system. That includes things like changing the electric grid. That includes things like switching to electric vehicles. All sorts of things are called out there as national projects. And so the resolution, if you ever want to know what the Green New Deal is in a nutshell, check out the resolution. It's only 14 pages. It's really easy to read. Um, but that's another thing. And so when people talked about like the Green New Deal doesn't have any specifics, a lot of what they meant was that the Green New Deal is a resolution. It's not a set of legislation that sets binding targets, right? Like we will stop selling all internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030, right? It doesn't say things like that, nor does it lay out exactly how to do that. And it wasn't meant to. The resolution was really meant to sketch out the boundaries of a Green New Deal, to explain succinctly what it is, what we're aiming for, and then to actually create the space so that organizers, think tanks, so many of the people who have to think about these intersections so that they could get involved. And the last thing that the Green New Deal is now is a movement. So you'll sometimes hear people talk about a movement for a Green New Deal. And what that means is there are a set of organizations that started with Sunrise and now includes everyone from like the Working Families Party to Sierra Club. There's a whole actually Green New Deal network that is made up of 15 of sort of like the biggest base building groups, movement groups, along with some unions. Who else is there? The Working Families Party, just a cross section of really powerful organizations that are all pushing for a Green New Deal. And now they have state affiliates. So it's really mushrooming out. And so the movement for a Green New Deal is also sometimes when people say like, Green New Deal right now, it's sort of shorthand for this movement of people that's pushing for it. So that's what the Green New Deal is in a nutshell, and that's how it's evolved. So it's important to also note that the Green New Deal we designed it and put out a resolution first because we wanted it to be a living thing. Talking about how to transform an economy is not something that you should do in isolation. It involves way too many people. You are talking about tons of people's direct livelihoods. You're also talking about changing the shape of people's lives in some way, right? You're talking about, what happens when to communities that are in the path of sea level rise. How do we move those folks? We're talking about, just a whole number of things that we really wanted folks, particularly folks who are close to the ground, to be able to weigh in on and help shape the Green New Deal. And so it has evolved from just sort of a proposal for a mobilization to, like I said, sort of a governing agenda, a resolution, and now a movement. And so given all of that and that evolution, I think often one of the funniest things that people come up and sort of talk to me about is they often think that the Green New Deal, we had like a bunch of money or power or George Soros behind us funding like a tiny progressive cabal or a large progressive cabal, depends on who you're talking to. But the truth is that like that wasn't how it happened. When we started developing the Green New Deal in earnest, as in taking it from something that uh, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and some of that first crop of progressives that were running when the squad was running, a lot of them talked about the Green New Deal, but no one really knew or had figured out yet what an economic mobilization that was about decarbonizing and transforming our economy and doing it justly, what that actually meant, what that would take. And so I was brought on to essentially figure that out and figure out what a Green New Deal needed to be and what shape it should take in September of 2018. I had just, this is pro tip, do not leave a political campaign and then start working on the Green New Deal a month later. Like, if anyone asks you to do that, don't work for a month after a political campaign. Just don't. Just all of it. Just don't do it. But I did it. I did it. And so it started in September of 2018. And I was the first hire at this little think tank that was started by two organizers who had come out of Justice Democrats. And I was able to hire two RAs, and that was it. And that was what we had to that was the policy muscle that we had to figure out the Green New Deal. And then in addition to that, we had Justice Democrats, who, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're essentially a political organization that runs essentially working class people for office, helps them sort of become known progressive challengers, and they run them for office. And so in that first class, they had Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Presley, Representative Omar, and I'm blanking on, Representative Tlaib. And so they had that first class, but they were about, Justice Dems was about a year, maybe 2 years old. And Sunrise was our main sort of organizing body that was working on it. And they were 2 years old, maybe 2 to 3 years old. None of us had big budgets or really any budget at all. And that was what we had. And I remember when we were working on the policy, reaching out to experts and people just blowing off our emails. People wouldn't even email us back. They didn't really understand what we were talking about. And so at best, we had like maybe 20 people tops. And all the representatives, particularly Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who was involved in helping to design it from the beginning, was the main champion. She was a first-year representative. So we didn't really actually have any infrastructure or power. And then what made it sort of doubly difficult was that we were trying to push this framework and sort of understanding of climate policy that wasn't really ever there before, at least in the mainstream. So on the Hill, everyone was talking about carbon taxes, and people just talked about climate change as a matter of emissions, right? Just get the amount of CO2 down, get the amount of greenhouse gases down. But we came in and we essentially argued that climate wasn't just about emissions, it was about our economy. It was about the way that our economy was structured. It was about the ways that our society was structured. And it was particularly about the ways that in sort of a really unequal balance of power and distribution of income and wealth was one of the main reasons that we were in this predicament to begin with. And so we were arguing that like racism, economic inequality, climate change, all of that was linked, and that policy should reflect that. And then on top of this, you have to remember that, you know, this was after '08, after one sort of big bailout, and in the midst of, you know, a Trump administration that was really, really pushing hard on, you know, the really neoliberal conservative line that government can't do anything, government should really just stay out of the way. It's about private industry. And we were also, I think, and this might have been even more than racism, is connected to climate change or equity and environmental justice is like an integral part of climate action. I think this part, the argument that the government had to take the lead and not the market, because the market actually could not fix the problems that we were seeing. And that the only entity that sort of had enough across the board power and resources to lead the charge was government. I think that was actually the most upsetting in DC to people. But that was like one of our really big arguments. And, and at the end of it, we were saying that if you do this economic mobilization right in the framework of a Green New Deal, you can actually create sort of a more just social contract and a new, renewed social safety net. And so all of that, those were all a set of arguments that have been made, in particular among environmental justice activists, but hadn't been brought to the mainstream, and certainly weren't the sorts of things that what people will call big greens, NRDC, National World Wildlife Fund, et cetera. It wasn't what they were talking about on the Hill. And so you have this like sort of tiny ragtag young team pushing a set of arguments that are like popular on the progressive side, but nowhere else. And also sort of insisting that we had an idea of how the economy worked and what was necessary to push forward economic growth, which again, we are young people, largely of color, progressives, like often the way that we treat the economy, particularly in DC and in policy circles, is that conservatives are the only ones who understand how the economy works, right? Progressives, you just want to tax and spend, all of that. And so we were also sort of putting forward an economic analysis. And so on a number of levels, it was new and jarring. But the things that we did have were better organizing. We had some of the best organizers in the country. And Sunrise and Justice Democrats who had active bases and who, because they were younger, I think less connected orgs, were willing to do things that maybe larger organizations who were more well connected, who had more power and access, might not be willing to do. Things like sit in Nancy Pelosi's office right after the election. We had a better understanding of media, especially social media, and how to make noise and how to sustain that noise. And also how, and this sounds very, people will say this trite, but in some ways, like how to be cooler than our competition and how to like seem cooler and talk in a way that was more relatable and just discuss policy from a place that was more human than I think a lot of other people had done it in a while, and that resonated. And we also had connections to climate movement groups, right? We weren't just sort of like a lone think tank on the Hill trying to push a new argument. And we had relationships with validators. So people, and that was actually one of my jobs, which is essentially to talk to folks, largely fancy white men, who people listen to about things, about the idea of the Green New Deal, and sort of organize them around the idea, to understand it, to see the ways that this could create a path for climate action that they have been fighting for decades and not seeing. And so we were able to sort of amass folks who might not have been the ones who wanted to stick their necks out right out the gate, but were, particularly as sort of the pace and the attention picked up, were willing to come out and say, hey, I think this is a really good idea. Right. Hey, I think in my now job, Roosevelt Institute, they were like some of the first economists to come on board and say, hey, this makes a lot of sense, and come out and support. And, now I work there. It's not an accident. But all of this is a long way to say that we had a lot of informal power. And I want to stress that, because really often we talk about power, and I feel like this point in life is like very disempowering. You just see the president acquitted, or former president acquitted, and it can feel like people who have power just aren't listening, and then it's pointless. What's the point if you don't have any power? But the fact is there's different types of power. And what we didn't have in money, we did have in essentially a sense of the world that other people were communicating, and channels to move that, and the ability to use the resources that we had, which was people, and also strategic connections with people who generate a lot of media, like Representative Ocasio-Cortez. And so I'll stop there, but I'll talk a little bit more, particularly if people have questions about sort of how that was or what that was like. But first, I just want to stop now that I've sort of filled you all in on that, and do a quick poll to see if that's how you thought the Green New Deal was created, or how you thought it went down. This is okay. So majority of people are saying no. That is not surprising. And I would love if people just want to hop in the chat with like, how was it different than what you thought happened? Um, okay, so yeah, 72% said no, and 28%, oh, look at you, savvy people, said yes. But I would love to hear, or you can just come off mute. It doesn't matter to me. Um, how you thought it differed, if you did think it was different. Don't be shy. Did you think we had a lot of money? Oh, it's a pretty, oh, I didn't know Sunrise tells a story. Oh yeah, yes, it was very movement driven, incredibly. Um, oh, thought it had way more money. Yeah, no. And the funny thing is like, when the right really got a hold of it, and they were just talking about cows and cow farts and everything on Fox News, and people would be like, why aren't you in front of that? We literally didn't have the money. We were like trying to raise money at the same time, and we were like, we don't have a communications department. Like we can't. And the interesting thing too was that also was hard getting on air too. Like people might actually talk about cow farts and then not actually invite us to counter. So they would just be on TV talking about cow farts, and no one would be there to say, but in fact, we won't stop cows from farting. There's no way to do that. Um, and they didn't ask us. So thinking that this had been specifically a specific policy for a while, um, yeah, so it was, so that the discussion of a Green New Deal, it did start in Europe. And so the one that we based ours on was a Green New Deal that came out of the UK in 2009, like right after the financial crisis. And it did filter through. The difference was that, so kind of every iteration of the Green New Deal talks about the economy, but in different ways. And so the British one was actually really focused on financialization because it happened right after the bank bailout. So it was all, if you hear now people talking about banks investing in fossil fuels and what the Federal Reserve can do and what the Treasury can do, that was essentially a lot of the UK Green New Deal. But the Green New Deals that happened, um, the ways that ours differed was a real, just like a really intense focus on environmental justice and some of the economic projects. It was more, I don't know, sort of industrial focused than some, but definitely there's many versions of Green New Deals out there. And it's really interesting to see how they develop. Um, so I wanted to return back. Thanks for sharing all of that. I wanted to turn back and talk a little bit about power and civic engagement and just ways in which um, I think a lot of people in this room likely have skills and advantages that will could help them do this type of work in the future, or just engage around climate policy or any sort of set of issues that you're interested in. um, and so one of the things that I wanted to point out is that often, like read someone say, I thought you all had a lot more money. And particularly with the sort of media coverage we got, a lot of people thought we got a lot more money because we were very like present. And the way that that works a lot of times uh, behind the scenes is that for most, particularly like a policy thing to get that much attention, often you would be having like a strong comms department, like a department behind you, um, or just sort of like a much bigger apparatus. But one of the sort of loopholes there that I think is really important to think about is that um, money follows power to some extent, and power follows attention. And many of you all know how to get attention, particularly like because there's media is, what am I trying to say? In part because of social media, right? Even a lot of traditional media is driven by social media. Journalists are on Twitter looking for stories, right? Journalists are following very closely, um, right? The way if something is continually popping up, right, in their news feeds, or in the case of the sit-in with Nancy Pelosi in Nancy Pelosi's office, right? That was an organizing decision made to get attention. And then one of the other ways that they knew that they could get attention is getting Representative Ocasio-Cortez there. And so that was one of the things that we did. And so sometimes I think it's important, particularly if you in places where you don't have money and you might not have a lot of formal power, figuring out how to get and sustain attention is important. And I think recognizing what advantage you have and being able to like use those channels. And then if you don't know how to get attention, like you can always find an organizer. The Green New Deal would not have happened if not for organizers. I could have written the same policy proposal and it would be nowhere right now. The reason that it is somewhere is because we worked with organizers, not just to like put it out there, but to actually formulate the plan. We were in conversation with Sunrise about it. Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office, the resolution, they did hours and hours and hours of consultation with unions, with environmental justice groups, with business groups. Um, they were all sort of over the place. And because of that, we were able to move in ways both like inside and outside because we had organizing on both sides. We had people organizing on the inside in the halls of Congress. We had people organizing on the outside. And believe me, I worked on policy before, and a lot of think tanks, there's policy and think tanks in DC are littered with ideas that are good ideas that don't go anywhere, right? That is one white paper, it's gone. And what the real difference is was that we worked with people who just sort of day in and day out um, hammered it forward, and they knew how to get attention, how to create conflict. They were organizers. And I always encourage people to find organizers, even if you're just figuring out policy, because organizers are fonts of knowledge, particularly on the local level. These are people that have been often thinking about or working on things for years. They know what local statute and councilman and what hearing is coming up. They are the folks who understand how how in particular a local community got to where they are, and how the problems got this big. And so that to me has been invaluable in creating policy, and it's invaluable, of course, in moving it. But I feel like at every level, organizers are incredibly important people to be in conversation with. And the last thing I think that I really want to emphasize, well, maybe not the last thing, but one of the biggest things that I really want to emphasize for you all is that one of the biggest advantages, if you can sort of, that you have and that you can cultivate, is living in reality, right? And looking at problems as they actually exist, not how you wish that they existed. And because one of the things, and I say that because one of the things that people sort of got upset at first with the Green New Deal was that they said we were doing too much, right? It's about the economy, it's about climate, it's about racial equality, it's about justice. Why would you, that's too much. It's too much to put into one policy. Why would you do that? And, you know, and we were talking about job creation and the fact that jobs could be created in ways that like give power back to communities, all these things. People are like, what, why would you talk about this all at the same time? Because like I said before, a lot of climate policy was like, we're going to pass a carbon tax, right? We're going to try to limit emissions in this way. We're going to, this is a higher fuel standard for a car, right? And all those are really important. That's not to say that they're not important. They are incredibly important. But the fact is, the Green New Deal looked the way that it did. It was so intersectional and it overlapped so much because that's how these problems happen in the real world, right? Like, I don't get to walk around um, and just be like, well, you know, if you all get to racial equity later, it's great, right? Like, that affects me. If you don't deal with racial equity, that affects who gets the jobs that you create. It affects where the money goes. It affects whose pockets get lined by those investments, right? And so all that we were saying is there is no reality in which you can make these choices and they don't affect these other things. There's no reality in which you can try to rapidly decarbonize and it doesn't change your economy, or it doesn't upset the fossil fuel industry, or it doesn't have an effect on the racial distribution of wealth. We are in a system where all of those things overlap. And so we were just trying to design a policy that did the same thing. Um, and it's one of the things, though, that even though people at the beginning were like, this is a mess, like, da 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 da, when it came down to it, uh, throughout the presidential election and the primary, one of the reasons that, and particularly now that the Green New Deal has come sort of back to the fore and that the Biden Harris administration is taking so many actions that look and are very Green New Deal-esque, is because all of a sudden we have a world where all of these crises are overlapping, right? Very openly. You have a health crisis, you have, I mean, racial injustice has always been a crisis, but you have that bubbling up in a new way. And you have climate change at the same time. And you need, and now, you know, we're in a point where we ideally need a recovery that, you know, takes us out of this whole addresses COVID and pushes us towards a green economy. And now what policy is around that actually grapples with all those? A Green New Deal, right? And so even though people didn't see it in the beginning, one thing that I knew and the folks that we worked with to develop it knew is that if you build something that is for reality, it will always come back. because people are going to need it eventually. Um, and we're going to end up in a place where we're going to have to try to do more than one thing at a time. And that's just what it was designed to do. So it's not really an accident that now there's like President Biden is talking about economic recovery and green jobs and clean energy and that, and you know, committing 40% of investments to frontline communities, right? The reason we designed the Green New Deal to sort of take that form, to be in some ways like an economic stimulus. And so I just encourage you all to do that because, particularly in DC, and I think in governments of all kinds, and I don't know exactly why this happens, but often the people at the top are more and more disconnected from what life actually is like and what it takes and what it feels like, you know, going through the world without a lot of power or a lot of wealth or a lot of money. Um, and and so if you can sort of hold all of that in your head, right, and face things as they actually are in design, or like work on campaigns that do that, essentially, I think in my experience, you end up outmaneuvering them at some point, essentially, just because you're able to see things and react in ways that they don't and can't. Um, and so I just like to tell people, just like it's okay to just treat things as they are. Like it's a lot more policy or just the sorts of things that we're trying to change when it comes to climate. It's okay if it feels a lot like pinball, where like you hit one thing and it hits a million things, you don't really know what's happening. It's supposed to feel that way. It's not mousetrap where you like hit a ball and then one thing happens and another thing happens and another thing happens. It's very orderly. It's that's just not how it actually is. And so if you do feel that way, um, I think it's okay. It just means that you're paying attention. And so we so it's 7:50. I'm gonna let everyone take a break. And what we're gonna do is on the whiteboard, we're gonna throw up a question. What skills do you have that you would use if you were pushing for a Green New Deal? Um, and you have a 5-minute break, but I just encourage you as you take that break, come back and just write on the whiteboard. What do you, if you were in the position of pushing a Green New Deal, uh, and it can be national, it could be state, it could be local. What skills do you uniquely have that you could use?
And for anyone who's not comfortable with using the whiteboard, because they're new to it, feel free to type your answers in the chat. But you can use both the text function up here at the top or the draw function if you feel like drawing pictures or writing anything out. So folks, it seems like for some reason, folks aren't able to write in the whiteboard. I'm not sure why, so just feel free to put your answers in the chat.
All right, I'm gonna give a couple more minutes because the answers in the chat are so good. I'm hearing a lot of communication skills, listening skills, networks, got some insider knowledge of Washington, always helpful. Um, uh, oh, hearing about uh, a youth climate organization scrapping a carbon pricing bill and going for a Green New Deal, amazing international policy, working in local gardens, working with local community already, um, helping people recognize moral priorities, including how to reconcile apparently opposed priorities. That's really important, like super important. Um, Heard someone say, I'm not afraid to stay in reality, which again, very important, really, really important. Um, so these are awesome. And I hope it got you all thinking about, I know it's very corny when people say like everyone has something to give, but you do. And often it's this kind of stuff that really makes a difference. Like one of the things for my job that was a small thing, I wanted to be a journalist. Actually, I wanted to be editor-in-chief of Vibe magazine my entire life. Went out of business when I was in college. That scrapped that dream. Ended up going to policy. But what it did mean is that I I had paid a lot of attention to writing. And also because I'm a Black woman who is often, from the South Side of Chicago in different spaces, like I understood how to talk to a lot of different people, which all turned out to be really important when we were working on something like a Green New Deal, where you have to sort of talk people through a lot of new ideas. And that's something that I didn't think about being helpful, but it turned out to be like really helpful. And so those sorts of things, like you have you have what it takes already to be a part of this movement or to push climate policy. And so I hope that you all see that now. And it's not to say that you can't grow. All of us can grow. We all learn different things, but you don't have to be a different person or learn a whole new set of skills to get involved in this work. Um, so let's go really quickly. Sorry, I have to pull up my talk again. Someone said permaculture, and I had to look up what that was. But I looked it up and it sounded very cool. Um, so, so what's next? So just to talk a little bit about what's happening. So the context now is really different. We have a lot of formal power. So there's a Democratic trifecta, there's a new White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy that is organizing the entire federal government, all of the agencies around the administration's climate goals. There's a lot of climate champions across the admin, right? And there's a lot of there's like new positions. So there's like a new climate advisor at the Treasury and at the State Department, right? So there's also a lot of implanting folks who are focused on these issues in agencies that might generally say where climate change isn't our thing. And because of the Green New Deal, all the activity around a Green New Deal, the sort of renewed focus on environmental justice, there's also an environmental movement now that we do have a lot more formal money and power now. And so that is sort of a new set of resources that is all at play. There's also agreement around some of the central ideas in the Green New Deal. So like the need for public investment in climate and clean energy. Clean energy is something that's fundamental to the US economy, particularly now that we're trying to dig out of recession. A need to transition our economy away from fossil fuels. And you see that in some of the Biden's executive orders around fossil fuels and moratoriums on leasing on public lands. And you have also sort of now a shared commitment, at least verbally, that environmental justice is key to any efforts to decarbonize or address climate change. And, down to the administration has said now that 40% of investments, right, will go to frontline communities. Well, now they're changing it to benefits of investments, which is a different thing. But that's still something that they're committed to. And so we're starting to see fruits of this, right? You have the Biden's like huge slate of executive actions on climate. You have the permit being revoked for Keystone XL. You have, like I said, the Office of Domestic Climate Policy. And then on the private sector, you have GM committing to only selling EVs by 2035. So, we're starting to see some changes. But we still have a lot to do. So we still have to figure out how to do a lot of these things, like how to get them through the structure of government that we have now. So for instance, all those executive orders, a lot of them direct agencies to do things like review the rollbacks of regulations under the Trump administration and try to undo them. But agencies might not necessarily know how to do those things, or the road to getting those things might have like different obstacles in different jurisdictions. And what I mean by that is like the government executive and legislative is really siloed. So you might have an issue, say with like electric grids, that you have an issue that has to go to like 3 committees and also FERC, right? Those sorts of across government issues, because that all of government coordinating for one objective is not something that has happened in an incredibly long time. So people are still figuring out how to do that. And so, for instance, at like 40% investment in environmental justice, that's a commitment that's from the administration. But with that one commitment alone, you have to figure out, how's the federal government going to map to figure out who's an environmental justice, what counts as a frontline community. Screening, how does that mapping connect to who gets money? How is that figured out? How much money do they get? How do you move 40% of investments through the federal budget process, which has tons of steps and regulations and rules? And how do you quantify? Are you talking about 40% of benefits from investments? Or are you talking about 40% of investments, period? That's very different. And all of that is before you even figure out where the money's going to on a local level, how to make sure that communities, that frontline communities actually get those jobs, that they're not just going to suburban contractors or big nonprofits that aren't run by people in the community. All those sorts of things have to be figured out. And then state and local have to figure out how to make all of these policies successful at their level, right? How to make things work for their state, how to make things work for their communities, how, in fact, they might do some of these things, right? Because state and local government might not have the capacity for new responsibilities. And then on top of that, we still have to really figure out what to do with the fossil fuel industry. The moratoriums are a great step, but they're temporary. And right now, no one, from the companies themselves to the federal government to anyone internationally, has a long-term plan for how to responsibly shutter the oil, gas, and coal industries, how to actually wind them down from producing what they're producing right now, doing the businesses that they are doing, how to, bring those down, how to reemploy those workers, where they will go. Those are really big questions. And we're talking again about about some of the biggest industries in human history, right? I was just talking to a colleague, and they were talking about like that our economy, sort of our modern economy, is actually built around these industries, not the other way around. And so these aren't little questions. And so there's some things you can do, right? Like talk about climate in your own lives. We talked about joining a group. We talked about figuring out how to plug in on what's happening in your sort of local and state context. What are your state laws? Are they going to help climate justice or hurt climate justice? How do just getting involved in those fights to make sure that your state can have a Green New Deal, right? That there aren't any laws in place that are preventing movement from happening, or that are really advantaging fossil fuel industries in your state or in your community. Becoming a climate voter, pressing your local government to pass their own Green New Deals. There are state Green New Deals, there are city Green New Deals that people are passing. And then the last thing I encourage people to do is like push for community involvement in economic planning initiatives by your local and state governments, because those things, the structure of your economy, where money's going to, what industries, what companies are going to come in, all of that has an effect on economic activity, which of course has an effect on decarbonization and environmental justice. But and so it's really important that local communities are able to be involved, to have a say in the way that um, that local economies are developing, especially because this is a pretty crucial time in which um, investments in fossil fuel industries or in things that are incredibly fossil fuel intensive, uh, there's a investments in those are pretty crucial right now, not just because it's not what we need, but because those things won't be the base of our economy, even in likely, I'm not Oracle, but by definitely not by 2050, probably much sooner. And so attaching a local or a state economy to those things is not smart. And so local and community involvement, particularly from climate activists or people who are involved uh, in the fight against climate change or the fight for environmental justice, it's really important that folks like that are involved in those decisions. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for questions um, from you all.
All right, and it looks like we have a first question. I'm seeing Karen Kling. Karen, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I read your section in Winning the Green New Deal, and I very much enjoyed it, but you talked a lot about how reducing inequality was your main route to solving the climate crisis. But the thing that I thought about when I read that was how research and development and education investments in those areas tend to raise all wages, not reduce inequality. So how do you plan to reckon with that, given that those are hot ticket liberal agenda items?
Wait, investment
Research
in
and
what?
development and education.
Research, development, and education.
Yeah, R&D.
That those rate.
Those raise all wages and not reducing inequality.
Yeah, that is true, but I don't think that we are talking about actually moving most money in those directions. R&D is an important part of industrial policy, but it's not the biggest part. And I think that raising wages, the fact that they raise wages, is of course important and useful, but I think uh, what you're talking about also isn't happening in a context where you're also um, sort of doing other things where you deliberately are changing the distribution of power and income, right? So for instance, like having a wealth tax, right? So the Green New Deal is talking about a package of all of those things, not R&D and education alone, but R&D in the context of you have a wealth tax, right? You are talking about new ownership structures, particularly around energy assets. You're talking about investing both in jobs, but in ways that support entrepreneurs and small businesses, and you know, ways that people sort of accumulate wealth as well. So I think that's where we're talking about something different than just putting money in R&D and education and then just letting it go where it goes.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
All right, next question is from Ava Bertoli.
Thank you. Thank you so much, by the way. It was so inspiring to hear from one of the actual authors of the Green New Deal. We've heard so much about it in Sunrise, but something we have been talking about a lot recently in Sunrise and with international climate activists is the potential of the Green New Deal to spur extractivism in global South countries, and whether there are clauses in the Green New Deal safeguarding against that, or whether that is something that has to be handled by
international policy and economics policymakers, or something that we've been wondering about?
Yeah. No, it's a little bit of both. So the Green New Deal is like very domestically focused. Like it's a very domestically focused plan, and that has plus and minuses. And I think largely we made that decision a lot for political reasons, and also from a place where we were like, if we can get the U.S. to get, excuse my French, to get our shit together, perhaps that will be the biggest contribution we can make for a while. But that is very true. Like renewables aren't, and a lot of that extraction is going to come from renewables, right? They're not, I think often we get into sort of like good and bad frames around technologies. And renewables can sound very angelic, but they have pros and they have cons. And one of the cons is that it's a lot of extraction. So I say a couple of things. One is that, like, yeah, a lot of it will have to come from international policy. And that's partially because I don't know why it is this way, but it does seem that sort of people who work on domestic climate policy and folks who sort of look folks who look internationally are quite siloed. Actually, we aren't often in the same rooms or conversations. And in a context right now where the administration, everyone's so focused on the domestic recovery, I think international climate folks are even further out of the room than they are at other moments in time. So I do think that a lot of that is going to have to happen there. And that's also a jurisdictional issue, right? Trade decisions around trade and the ways that we engage internationally are also very siloed just in government. They happen in certain departments and in certain contexts, and no one else deals with it. So that's a gap that I learned about more after the resolution came out. And so in my own work, I'm trying to knit it together, but it takes obviously more than me. So I would say that. And then the second thing that I like to talk about is the fact that we have to go towards renewables. Like there's not an alternative, which means that we're gonna have to extract. The question is, how do you extract in ways that are not coercive and unequal? Right. And so that's also where I want to push, which is that we're going to have to take these things out. But what does it mean when the folks who should be in charge of it, so not just government, but indigenous people, right, when it's on their land, what happens when they set the terms of extraction upon which extraction can happen? And I think that is actually really important, because I don't think extraction is inherent, always has to be exploitative, but often we haven't explored what that means for it to not be exploitative, because we're always extracting in exploitative relationships, right? Like forcing the other party, even in environmental justice, right? It's coercion. I grew up in a community that had elevated amounts of pollution. I have asthma. I had asthma growing up. I have it now, much less now, but I still have it. My mom didn't know that. She didn't agree to that. We were coerced, right, to bear that burden. And so what does it mean to, and dumping pollution is not, that's a totally different, that's not okay under any circumstances. But in these times where we actually have to extract, how do we do that in ways that are just? And is that possible? And if so, what's that relationship look like? And I think it weighs heavily on letting other folks who are not us, the ones who have the most formal power, the ones who actually control the resources, letting them set the terms. But that's, that can be a little bit Pollyanna-ish, because again, indigenous folks can be, really underfoot some governments and nations where we do have to extract from. So that's an ongoing issue, but that's kind of where I like to go, because we're not going to live in a reality where that isn't necessary.
Thank you so much.
All right, our next question comes from Annie Volker.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I just feel like this has been so inspirational and insightful. So yeah, thank you. You mentioned this earlier about just like incorporating the Green New Deal into like COVID relief. And I just like wanted to hear a little bit more about that and how likely you think that this will take place and like in what form that we might see it.
Yeah, totally. So I actually just wrote a paper about this not that many months ago. And so we used a couple arguments to talk about why COVID relief, why climate change needed to be, uh, or climate action needed to be part of COVID relief. One, like really, two of the biggest reasons is one, that the way that we do agriculture, um, particularly meat production, and factory farming, which is a huge source of emissions, particularly in the agricultural sector. Um, that's one of the main reasons we have these sort of rapidly mutating pathogens that we can't keep up with, that are, starting to do things like create the COVID pandemic and other pandemics. So one argument is that like we actually have to move on emissions, and also weather patterns are changing, so disease is spreading in different ways, and all of these, the vectors of disease are changing. Basically, so that's one reason why climate action is important, so that you actually reduce the source of these problems. The second reason that climate action is really important in terms of COVID relief is that people of color are dying and being hospitalized at higher rates from COVID, in large part because of toxic pollution. Right. So when that first sort of wave of COVID hit and the hot spots were like New Orleans, Detroit, New York, you could sort of lay maps of frontline communities and fossil fuel pollution. And it was like the same spots. Like it's not accidental. And so that's important. And the last thing that we say is that COVID relief, any relief package, it's one of the biggest movement of money in government that ever happened, are recovery and stimulus packages. And whenever you're moving that much money, you are influencing the shape of your economy. So rules change in order to put that money out. And also it's just a large amount of resources. It sort of shapes economic activity. So if you're not thinking about climate change, you could be doing negative things, right? Because none of it is carbon neutral at this point. And so that's the other emphasis for investing in COVID relief, or doing some things around climate as part of COVID relief. That, and of course, like it's a recession, and climate or clean energy is like one of the main drivers of jobs. It was the number one job creator before COVID-19 hit, and it will likely be afterwards. And so all of those reasons, is it going to happen? Yeah, I think yes, to some extent. The first relief package that President Biden has announced doesn't have much about climate in it. That was sort of expected, because it's meant to be very focused on hospitals, emergency funding, vaccination, et cetera. There's a second package that he's calling a recovery package, that's more medium and long-term investments. And that's where they're expecting more of the climate investments, some of those big climate investments to come forward, as well as, and that package might happen through budget reconciliation, which you can look up if you're interested in that. And so I say that because if it happens through budget reconciliation, some things aren't allowed. Budget reconciliation means that you can essentially give more money to existing programs. You can only do things that have budgetary impact. So you can't say something like, oh, 40% of investments have to go to frontline communities. You can't do that in budget reconciliation, but you can give a bunch of more money to the EPA. So those, you might see different types of things happening, but you will definitely see some investments in climate, some big ones, happen in the recovery package.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, next question comes from Liana Biasucci.
Hi, my question is a little bit similar to Annie's. So last semester I wrote my senior capstone project, kind of a one semester thesis about a green economic recovery from COVID. And in that research, I came across the recovery from 2008, where there were a few green recovery things, like there was Obama's clean transportation and some clean energy, but there wasn't kind of an enduring commitment to those investments. So we didn't see, the long-term changes that they were hoping for. So I'm wondering if you think the landscape is different now and there might be more of an enduring commitment.
Yes, I do think there will be more of an enduring commitment. I think it will be tough, though. I don't think it's automatic, is what I mean. I think people will still have to push for it. ARA was really interesting because it was actually, so the last recovery package was the biggest investment in clean energy that the US had ever done, or on climate policy. So I forget how much money it was, but it was essentially an eighth of the entire recovery allocations went towards things that were about climate. But you're right, they funded a lot of really important and interesting things. In particular, the folks who ran the investments at DOE purposefully invested in demonstration projects that showed essentially the viability of solar, like large scale solar generation. So they built the biggest solar project as part of that. And that was really great. And what that did is that banks were refusing to finance those things before they funded the government funded those projects, and then banks figured out essentially how they could be profitable and started funding them themselves. And so that was helpful in some ways, like an enduring source of funding, but that was all private sector funding. And you're right, the public sector funding after the term it was written for in the recovery, it didn't go anywhere, and they didn't attach even the most successful of those programs to long-term funding sources that would allow them to keep going. And so I think now that is more likely, particularly because climate is seen as is being treated as sort of a really important piece of this next recovery. And the administration also has commitments to climate that are based in sort of job creation and economic policy that go beyond the next recovery package. So I'm hopeful, but I don't know exactly what those things are that will get enduring funding, or how enduring people define enduring for. It could be an extra year, it could be longer. But the other thing is that, like, dedicated funding. Anyway, sorry, I was going to say something very boring about budgets, but anyway, yeah. So we'll see.
Can I ask a kind of part two? Do we have time for that?
Yeah.
Just, you mentioned like the private sector funding. Do you think if the public sector encourages that in the short term and the private sector takes over in the long term, kind of with the demonstration project you mentioned, is that enough? Like, do you personally think that'll get us to where we need to be?
Oh, all the way? No, but I do think private sector investment is important, right? The government isn't going to do everything. We don't need the government to do everything, right? Like, and so I think the question is, what do you want to fund with public money, and what is fine being funded by private money, right? And so I think that there are spaces, say, distributed, so like residential solar, getting solar panels on homes, where like the government could play a role in, say, like with the weatherization assistance program that's all across the nation, allowing those programs to install solar panels on low income folks' home. That's helpful. does the government need to be producing solar panels in its own solar panel factory?
Not really.
Probably not. It's not really going to help, and so I think that is the question, where it's like, yeah, private sector money to get more solar panels out there is great, right? That's great, but maybe the federal government has a role to play in like getting things out there. And there are places where you might just want federal money, right, to do that thing, or to start working on that thing, or to fund that thing long term. But I think it's just a question of figuring it out, and it's also not a hard and fast question. People differ on what private sector and public sector should do all the time. But it is, I think the question is just like, when do you want which one? And what are the costs in terms of equity and justice to either side?
Okay, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Rhiana, we have 3 people with hands raised. I know that'll push us over 8:30. Would you prefer to only take one more question?
I will, why don't we take all 3 and I'll try to answer them rapid fire style.
Okay, so Kathy Weber, you are first.
Hi. Is there a plan for national service included in the Green New Deal, like the Civilian Conservation Corps or AmeriCorps? I built houses with Habitat for Humanity for 2 years through AmeriCorps, and think national service could go a long way to unifying our country and give many opportunities for people to learn while contributing to the greater good.
Yeah. So rapid fire, yes, there is a call for a Civilian Conservation Corps. It's not in the resolution, but it has come up a few times as part of a Green New Deal. So that is something that is supported, and I think is envisioned as part of sort of the public employment parts of the Green New Deal. I will say the only hesitation that I have around service is making sure that it's not a Civilian Conservation Corps isn't the only option, or that the Corps is designed for people with care responsibilities, right? That have kids, that so that it's paid a living wage, because I think often Corps models, we pay very little, assuming that people are young, that they have family support, and it can, I think, limit who can do the work and actually sort of create an unequal playing field from the very beginning. And so that's always been my hesitation around it. So I think that it should be part, but not the only type of public employment, just so there are options for people in different situations.
Thanks.
All right, next question will be from Maggie O'Hanlon.
Hello.
Maggie, we can't hear you very well.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, wait, no, it went away
It was
again.
better and now it's not. Why don't we turn to Ev and then we'll come back to you, Maggie?
That sounds good.
Hi, thanks for this. My major concern, and it's kind of broad-based though, is that in this economic transformation, that you're going to have, everybody's going to have to change their focus and stuff. So when everybody says, oh, Exxon and big coal and blah, blah, I think of, workers, and political reality is very often white workers. But everybody's going to have to shift, and that it's all going to turn into an us and them, winners and losers thing. And I think the New Deal has to be for everybody, and has to be understood that way. Otherwise, you're going to, the politics are just tear this thing apart. And it's already started. It's already started. And I'm not denying the reality of social justice at all. Been working on that for a long time, but I understand the political reality of the winners and losers and how they could be marshaled against this. And I thought maybe you could comment on that.
I don't know if I'm 100% clear on what you're asking, but I think I get the essence of it, which is how do we make it clear that this is for everyone and it doesn't become like an us versus them?
I mean, the extraction industry, I'll just throw somebody out there. I mean, guys are working on oil fields, or they're working in on the towers, or in the they're getting high wages, mostly union jobs, getting stuff out of the ground, and that's got to stop. And I don't know how you deal with that.
So I mean, that's a really good question, and there's a reason that we don't talk about it very often or in depth, because no one has a great answer. The answer is essentially you try to replace those jobs with commensurate jobs. How you do that is not a walk in the park, and also the timelines don't always match up. Just because something is going under doesn't mean that the new jobs are available all of a sudden in the right place. And so I don't have a hard and fast answer, except we're just trying really hard to work it out and trying to figure out if there is a sequence of social safety net provisions that say, I don't know, if changes happen in unemployment policy or in what was I just talking about recently? Unemployment policy or healthcare. There's an angle there where people say aim for those first, and then it will make it easier for people to transition. Which that is also a huge sequencing issue. So there's no real answer. The thing that I do say though is that like winners and losers, us versus them, that has been the framework. That's the framework of white supremacy. That's also how we got here.
I totally
and so it's just, I think right now, I don't think that there's an easy answer. We just are trying to figure it out as it goes.
Yeah, well, it's a hard one.
Yeah.
maybe the hardest one, I think. But
yeah, it is definitely the hardest.
Think coal miners too, same deal. Coal is a myth. Nevertheless, it's an enduring myth. And
exactly. It's the hardest. It's definitely the hardest part. And I don't have an answer.
Well, we'll work on it.
That's basically it. So Maggie put her question in the chat.
She put a question in the chat, but she's actually in the class that you're visiting tomorrow, so she said she'll make sure to ask it tomorrow, so that way we don't.
Oh, perfect. That we can do that then, so we don't keep people too long. All right. Well, that's it for me. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a pleasure talking to you all and talking about civic engagement. And I hope all of you have a good night. And if you had a 3-day weekend, a good last, 3 hours.
And before we go, just want to let everyone know that this is the first event of this semester for the Sustainability Office. I'm putting in the chat information about where you can find other events, as well as where you can add events of your own. That's both campus and community events. The other sponsors of this event were the College of the Environment, so I'm putting a link to their website there. COE also hosts a lot of events and a lot of engaging information. And then the last sponsor is Academic Affairs, as well as the Albritton Center for the Study of Public Life. If you go to their website, at the very bottom, you can sign up to receive their weekly email. It's one of the best places that I know to find information. So thank you so much, Rhiana. Thank you everyone for coming, and hope to see you at our next event. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen and Rhiana.